paper that I'm going to be talking about today, it's a section of a paper. The paper is called Delineating Categories. I'm withholding it from publication at the moment because I want to give another section of the paper at the IPRA meetings next summer. This is section 1. And it comes out of a seminar on categories that I gave last year. And there was an issue that kept repeatedly coming up because I kept raising it. And that was a student would give a presentation and I would say, what is your justification for treating this data in categorical terms? Why do we need categories? Why do we need to invoke categories in order to talk about this data? So I've been thinking about that since the seminar is over, and I've come up with something loosely resembling answers. So that's what I want to talk about. I begin with what I call the "this cup is red" problem. Michael Billig wrote in a wonderful book, by the way, called Arguing and Thinking. He says, to say that this cup is red is to make a categorization. The cup has been categorized as belonging to the wider category of red objects. Now, I had a problem with this. He's surely right in a set theoretic sense, but from a discursive point of view, we could ask, is the speaker invoking a category here or just describing some particular object? And in fact, that same problem occupied Chegov's attention, as I discovered some years later. He formulated it as the problem of distinguishing an attribution or a description from a categorization. So, first of all, what exactly is a category? According to the online Cambridge Dictionary, a category is a grouping of people or things by type in any systematic arrangement. So let's break that down a little bit. A category is, first of all, a set of items. And the grouping is by type, which I understand to mean that the items share some common attribute. Now, there's a distinction here, which I never see made in any of the definitions of category. And that is that we need to distinguish categorical relations from part-whole relations. For a categorical relation, the members of the category are examples of the category. So for instance, an elm is an example of a tree, and the tree is a category, therefore, in relation to an elm. But let's say New York comprises a number of places, Times Square, Columbus Circle. That is a part-whole relationship. Times Square is not an example of New York. It's a part of New York. I think it's really important to keep that distinction in mind because the logic of the kind of inclusion relationship that is categorical is a different logic from the inclusion relationship, which is part-whole. I don't have time to go into this, but there's some interesting stuff to be said. And finally, in the definition that we're looking at, it says in any systematic arrangement. And I don't know what they mean by that, but I would note that categories occur in relation to other categories, frequently in taxonomical structures. Okay. Now, Edwards talks about the linguistic notion of categories. And he says, in the linguistic notion, just about all words are categories. A sentence such as, the cat sat on the mat, can be analyzed for how all of its words categorize objects, events, times, definiteness, and spatial location. Word meaning is equated with semantic categorization. He's not necessarily endorsing this, but he's saying that's the way that it's viewed in linguistics. Every word, with certain exceptions, is a category in at least two ways. First of all, in the way that Billig was talking about, this cup is red is equivalent to this belongs to the category red cup. But there's another way in which it is a category, and that is that red comprises a whole range of colors. So red categorizes vermilion and scarlet and so forth. So those are the two ways in which words can be categories, or at least the two ways that I've identified. Now, consider Socrates' moral. Edwards says that this is a named entity, Socrates, which is explicitly placed into a named category, mortal. But mortal is a category only in the first sense. It's not a category in the second sense, as far as I can see, because there's only one way to be mortal. It's not a range of possibilities. Either you're mortal or you're not. So it's a category in that sense. Looking at other kinds of words, verbs, adverbs, prepositions, they're categories in at least the second sense, and sometimes, as with mortal, which was an adjective, in the first sense as well. So the question is there some analytic profit in treating this expression in this context as a category? That is, whatever expression we're talking about. Is its categorical nature relevant for the participants in the discourse? So that's why I call this when as a category. So continue. Now we consider what Shegloff has to say about this. You can see it on the screen, but I'll read it along with you. If we want to categorize the parties to some interaction with some category terms, we need, in principle, to show that the parties were oriented to that categorization device and producing and understanding, moment by moment, the conduct that composed its progressive realization. That is, in other words, we have to be able to ascertain that this was a category for participants. And again, the upshot of this line of inquiry, these are not successive paragraphs in Shegloff's paper, they're selected paragraphs. The upshot of this line of inquiry is parties to talk and interaction can and do discriminate between attributes and categories. So analysts should not simply treat the former as virtually doing the latter. Well, his principles seem right to me, but the way that he applies them is, if not wrong, then crucially limited. And I want to talk about that because I think it uncovers some important things. So we're looking at B says, I'm going to just do a rough reading of this. Yeah, this fella I have, this man, who I have for linguistics is really too much. Didn't notice it, I didn't notice it, but there's a woman in my class who's a nurse. And she said to me, she said, did you notice he has a handicap? And I said, what? You know, I said, I don't see anything wrong with him. She says, his hands. So the next class, for an hour and 15 minutes, I sat there and I watched his hands. Why, what's the matter with his hands? He doesn't have full use of his fingers or something. And he holds the chalk funny. His fingers don't bend. She said, you know, she had experience with handicapped people, she said, but you know, in the field that they try even harder, you know, than a regular instructor, you know, do in the class and everything. And she said, usually harder markers. I'm going to stop there, that's enough. Shegloff comments on this. He says, first half dozen lines here are full of category terms: feller, man, woman, nurse. But how about the characterization attributed to the nurse at the double-headed arrow, line 7? That he, the feller, man, who she has for linguistics, has a handicap. Is that a categorization, or is it just a description, an attribute? Look next at the 3-headed arrow turn at line 24. Here we see handicapped made into and used as a category term in a manner quite distinct from the usage or practice at line 7. Handicapped people, its members are referred to with plural terms: common sense knowledge. Common sense knowledge gets deployed about members of the category. People like that try even harder. They're harder markers and so forth. So here's an entering wedge, perhaps for exploring the attribute category issue in an empirically grounded manner, and not just as a matter for conceptual stipulation or logical analysis. Well, I wouldn't argue with the notion that has a handicap is possibly just an attribute and not a categorization. It seems to be a description of this particular person. I don't see that it is invoking a category of handicapped people. It's talking about this one person. But the thing is, Shageloff uses categorization as equivalent to member categorization in this quotation. And so he perhaps overlooks, because of that, he may overlook the fact that handicap, the word handicap, is a category, and that in fact it is treated as such. Why is that so? Because handicap has to do with his hands. That is, there are all kinds of handicaps, and this is a particular handicap. When we speak of a kind of X, in this case, a kind of handicap, we're treating handicap as a category. Now, the phrase, when he says handicapped in line 24 is a categorization, well, actually, what he's talking about is the phrase handicapped people. And of course, people is categorization anyway, regardless of whether it's modified with handicap. So I think that at least there's an issue there as to what's going on. Another thing, feller, man, woman, nurse, he mentions them all as recognizable category terms without offering any justification for that. But when we get to handicapped people, he offers 2 reasons for viewing it as a category. First of all, he says it's plural. And secondly, it is mentioned in association with common sense knowledge. Well, neither of those things applies to feller, to man, or to woman, all of which he calls categories anyway. Nevertheless, I would accept that those terms are categories and that they function as such in the talk, because each one is used to classify an individual. But how about really too much? He's really too much in line 3. I would say that that's a category as well, and that there's evidence that it is a category. There's all kinds of ways of being really too much. And in this case, the things that are mentioned are that he's a hard marker and that he maybe tries too hard. And again, I think a similar argument could be made for hold, as in line 17, 18, she says, he holds the chalk funny. Well, there's all kinds of ways of holding something, and she's mentioning one particular way. So that too, hold, is a category. So actually, there's a lot more categories here than what Shageloff is willing to talk about. My point is not merely that these expressions, like most or all linguistic expressions are categories, but that they have categorical functions in the talk. This is also from Shegloff's article. The article, by the way, is the 2007 article, a tutorial on membership categorization analysis. I'm going to read this one too. I'm so tired. I played basketball today since the first time I was a freshman in high school. B says basketball. Yeah, for basketball where? Yeah, like for an hour and a half. B says, where did you play basketball? Ava says, in the gym. B says, in the gym. Ava says, yeah, like group therapy. You know, half the group that we had last term was there. We just played around, fooling around. And yeah, so some guys who were better, you know, went off by themselves. So it was two girls against this one guy, and he's tall, you know. And I couldn't stop laughing. And Shegloff writes about this. He says, here the reference is at lines 2, freshman in high school, 12, half the group, 18, the guys, and 19 girls surely seem to be category terms of the sort that Sachs was dealing with. But how about tall at line 20? He's tall, you know. Does that count as categorizing him? Well, Shegloff picked nouns and noun phrases referring to persons as surely category terms of the sort that Sachs was dealing with. You know, he's talking about what he calls a problematic conflation of description and categorization, but we have to consider that categorization is necessarily a description. So if you say, she's a doctor, you're categorizing her, but you're also of necessity describing her. The problem then is the other way, is a description necessarily a categorization? That's really the question that Shegloff is dealing with. And Shegloff argues that tall does not, as it's used in segment 2, does not count as a categorization. He says that the expression he's tall is an attribute that resonates category relevance, I'm quoting, resonates category relevance. But for now, this remains an inchoate intuition. Does it come down to parts of speech then, nouns or noun phrases versus other grammatical categories? Well, my argument is that it is appropriate to treat tall as a category as well, because she's using it in the context of having an advantage at basketball. And all tall persons, not simply this person, have an advantage at basketball. So tall is actually referring to the category of tall persons. So I think Shegloff actually got that wrong. We should treat an expression, this is sort of the crux, we should treat an expression as a category when there's some analytic profit in doing so. For conversation analysts, the occasion for invoking categories is precisely when something categorical is being done in a talk. For example, the participants treat or refer to an item in the talk as a category, where category refers to a class of things, including persons, objects, actions, ideas, qualities, occasions, and so forth. That is, when there's explicit reference to a set. Secondly, when the participants specify examples of an expression, that may be beginning with the expression and listing its examples, or alternatively, beginning with the examples that implicate the category. And finally, when participants use an expression in a way or context that implicates associated category-bound features or use category-bound features to implicate the category. Now, these may not be the only occasions for using or invoking categories in an analysis. It's the ones that I could think of. If you come up with others, more power to you, let me know. Now, I want to finish with two short examples that maybe will clarify things a bit. One of these, I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with, if not most of you, is from Sachs, a Sachs lecture. And it's a social worker talking to a guy who's been, who's under suspicion, let us say, of having somehow abused his wife. And the social worker, A, says, "Didn't you smack her one?" B says, "No." A says, "You're not telling me the story, Mr. B." And that particular line is the focus for Sachs analysis, but it's not the line I'm interested in. The line that I'm interested in is the next one. B says, "Well, you see, when you say smack, you mean hit." And he says, "Yeah, you shoved her, is that it?" Now, what I want to show here is that although we wouldn't necessarily, in every context, treat hit as a category, although linguistically, of course, it is a category, there is reason to treat it as a category here. When he says, when you say smack, you mean hit, he's saying it in the sense of when you say elm, you mean tree. Now, that is, smack is one kind of hit. That's what makes it sensible to say this. Otherwise, he's just, you know, if hit were just a synonym for smack, it wouldn't really make much sense to bother to say it at all. So what does that accomplish when you say smack, you mean hit? That is categorizing it that way. Well, in some contexts, you know, if you say, when you say oak, you mean tree, you might be disambiguating it because are you talking about furniture or are you talking about trees? Well, when you say oak, you mean tree is one way of disambiguating. That's not what's going on here. There's no ambiguity about what smack means here, although smack does have other meanings. It could mean a small ship, a small boat, or it could mean a slang for heroin, but there's no ambiguity here. He's not clarifying what smack means. What he's doing is saying, I didn't smack her, and in fact, I didn't do anything that could be called hitting her, so I didn't punch her either. So it'd be obtuse for the A to say, did you punch her? Because we just ruled that out. Now, the fact that A doesn't say it doesn't prove anything, but I'm making the claim on linguistic terms. That is, any speaker of English knows that smacking is a kind of hitting. So I'm treating hit as a category, and I'm treating it as a category because it's analytically useful to do that, because what it does as a category is to take punch off the table. Now, my final example comes from a very useful article by Kay Bushnell. I know most of you have read it, but if you haven't, I certainly recommend it to you. But I'm going to take issue with his analysis of this particular segment. This is between Saburo, and who's a native Japanese, and Dan, who's Caucasian American, who lives in Japan. And I'm just giving you the English. Saburo says, a long time ago, they used ketchup to season spaghetti in Japan. Dan says, yeah. Saburo says, oh, you know? And Dan says, yeah. Saburo says, it's called like Neapolitan. And Dan says, right. My wife used to make that all the time. And S says, laughing, she used to make it. Okay, so my question here is Saburo claiming membership in the category Japanese old timer, and in contrast to Dan's foreign newcomer, which is the analysis that Bushnell gives us. He says that Saburo can be heard to be claiming membership in the category Japanese old timer. And he tries to establish this in the way that participants, and that he tries to establish that this is the way that the participants themselves see the matter. And he notes that Dan in line 3 contradicts Saburo's proposed, I'm quoting, proposed categorization framework. Saburo goes on in line 7 to challenge Dan's epistemic claim and to reassert his own epistemic authority together with his original categorizations, which Dan once again denies. There's more to it, but that's what we need for our purposes. So my question here is Dan challenging a categorization or just a claim of superior knowledge on a particular matter? And I would be inclined to use Occam's razor here and to dispense with unnecessary entities. The analysis stands perfectly well as a struggle over epistemic primacy in relation to a bit of cultural knowledge without dragging membership categories into it, unless there's some further data, which we don't get here, that makes a categorical analysis desirable. In fact, it would seem to me that you could get the same conversation between Dan and a non-Japanese student of Japanese culture or of Japanese cuisine. Now, Bushnell's analysis, to be sure, seems perfectly reasonable. Saburo is, after all, a native Japanese, and Dan is an American. So surely we can assume that Saburo is speaking as a native of the culture to a non-native. Not doing that badly on time. That Saburo is speaking, we could assume that. So it would seem that Saburo in this context is relevantly Japanese, and that his Japaneseness gives him reason to suppose that he knows more than Dan about what Japanese eat. But this is common sense. It's not demonstrable, or at least it hasn't been demonstrated in the talk. What the interactants probably have in mind is not a proper subject for conversation analysis. Maybe I can quote another article by Bushnell, where he says that rather than drawing on tacit members' knowledge regarding native, non-native speakership, the analyst must attempt to, quote, the actual actions and orientations of the participants. So this last example points to another issue, a different issue than the one that's flagged by Shegroff. Bushnell is not treating a mere description as a category. Rather, if my argument is right, he's using his experience to, quote, see a standardized categorical pair, native, non-native, in his data. I'm not claiming that categories in discourse have to be overtly mentioned in order to have a place in conversation analysis. That's not my problem with his analysis. There are categories which may be present in talk that may or may not have a lexical representation in the language, but that do not appear in lexical or phrasal form in the discourse under consideration. These are what I term implicit categories, categories that are implicated by participants' talk. But in order for us to make analytic claims about implicit categories, we have to be able to demonstrate rather than intuit their existence in the data. Now, I've focused on, in this talk primarily on the issue of description versus category, but I think the issue of implicit categories, that is of when it's legitimate to read categories into the data, is of equal significance. As a matter of fact, that was the thing that came up most often as an issue in my seminar. So that's it. I wanted to make this talk funny, but categories, it seems, are just not funny. Maybe next time I'll try with turn taking or repair. So that's it. Thanks for listening.